Hi, my name is Crystal. This Saturday night, the UFC returns, and BetStamps has joined up with the Todd Atkins Show to provide a one-stop shop website for all of your gambling needs. When you visit Todd's page, signupexpert.com/TAS, you'll be connected to all of the sports books in your region, along with a review of each platform and its unique benefits. All of these sports books have valuable offers for new users. So when you register through MyLink, you'll automatically receive the top offers at each one. So if you want to take advantage of these benefits and support the Todd Atkins Show, please consider signing up for your next sports book at expertsignup.com/TAS. Again, my name is Crystal, and you can find me on TikTok at unapologeticallyme0424. Happy gambling!
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Drew with High Fight IQ, and you are now watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with my boys Todd Atkins and Miguel Iturrate. Miguel has been the matchmaker for over 200 shows worldwide and has worked with Hook and Shoot, Euphoria, Bodog, and ADCC. Make sure you subscribe to the Todd Atkins Show on YouTube. You can also find Miguel on his YouTube channel at MMA Collector 74. Don't forget to subscribe to High Fight IQ on all social media platforms, the House Call Sports on YouTube, the Fight Pit on YouTube. Now let's talk some fights, baby. Let's go.
All right, so it's Todd Atkins, and I'm here with Miguel Iturrate and Joel Gerson, who we just did a video on. Weren't really planning on talking to him prior, but I reached out to him, was able to get a hold of him and get him on here. Joel, we're super appreciative of you doing that and your time. And, you know, for everyone, we want to thank our sponsors, Live to Fight and BetStamp. And maybe before we get started, Joel, maybe you can kind of introduce yourself to people if there's people out there who aren't aware of who you are.
Sure. So yeah, Joel Gerson. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for 35 years now. I'm black belt in both IJF Judo and IBJJF BJJ. But when I started jiu-jitsu, there was no International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation in Canada, so it was kind of the Wild West. I've been training since I was a kid, like since I was 13. I competed at the national level in judo and more recently at the World Masters in Jiu-Jitsu, and I fought MMA in Japan for a little bit. But I've been operating MMA gyms and teaching Jiu-Jitsu for I've been teaching for about 35 years, and I've been running gyms for over 15 years.
Now, it's a little bit of a humble intro because you would be what I would qualify definitely as a Canadian legend. Like you said, there might be some people who don't know you, but everybody in Canada knows you, and every MMA fighter from Canada owes you a debt of gratitude, I think, because
thank you very much.
You fall into that pioneer category for sure. So what we did was I run a site called the MMA Museum. We started a recent segment of, just looking at classic fights where we rewatch them with, and comment on them, sort of like people do reviews now of, music videos, old music and old movies and things like that. I said, let's do fights because, that's what we know about. And your fight was a no-brainer to look at because you go back to 96, 97, that era. That was absolutely a classic. It has to be, for that year probably, and for many years to come, the biggest upset that we had seen. To me, Ruben Asado was probably the first guy who you had to consider as maybe a pound-for-pound number one guy in the world. And, you may have, I'm obviously would love to hear your opinion on that, but Sato, when you fought him, was 11-0, and you were 0-0. You had your judo background, your Wild West jiu-jitsu. Were you going to Brazil already to study jiu-jitsu or bringing a Brazilian up? How did that work for you? How was your intro to jiu-jitsu?
So just to touch on some of the things you said, he was considered pound for pound. And it was NHB at that time, right? No holds barred. So there was NHB ranking, and he was considered pound for pound the number one best fighter in the world at that time. Everybody was behind him. He was Joe Silva's favorite fighter, the legendary UFC matchmaker, and they were never able to get him over to UFC. And I asked him recently, actually, on Instagram. I messaged him and I go, by the way, how come you never ended up going to the UFC? And he was just loyal to Shuto. You know,
That's, yeah.
which is admirable, which is admirable. And I think there was a timing issue as well. I forget, he might have said something else as well. But back then, I wasn't supposed to fight him. What's interesting is, so Carlos Newton was a training partner of mine, and at the time, I was already brown belt, and he had joined my instructor and myself for training. But he was very raw, and he didn't have a lot of experience, but he was learning very quickly. He was hyper talented, and he was dedicating a lot of time to training at that time. And he had gone over to the Valetudo, and he had beaten Eric Paulson pretty handily at the time. And Eric Paulson was a legend in Japan. And I was a full-time university student, and the Japanese had asked my instructor, "Do you have anybody else?" And my instructor was like, "Yeah, let me look around." And at that point, I was senior to Carlos. Like, he was, you know, there's that hierarchy in dojos. He was my junior. And so it was set up. But the funny thing is that Sato at that time, we had witnessed him dismantle John Lewis, and John Lewis was already, I mean, it was already a legend quickly at that time, and we had all looked up to him as, you know, one of the best. So when we saw the fight, because it was the same card that Carlos had fought Eric Paulson, when we had seen Sato beat John Lewis, the joke that my instructor had said at the time, because we were watching it on a VHS tape. Carlos had come back from Japan, and all the students were watching it in the dojo, and we were watching Carlos's fight and watching the whole card, which is a big, it's a big event to get a VHS tape back then. It's some mixed martial arts, but
Yes.
we saw Sato just doing these flying armors and everything, and my instructor was like, "Oh, don't worry, you want to fight him, not in your first fight." And then we get a fax from Japan saying we would like Mr. Gerson to fight Mr. Sato in his first fight. And I was like, "Well, that's crazy." And my instructor said, "No, no, you should do it." And he said, "We'll negotiate." That they said, we'll bring Mr. Gerson, even if he loses, we'll bring Mr. Gerson back for 2 more fights, and we'll pay him. I forget what it was. And my instructor was like, "You should sign it. We'll fax back that we should, you should do it and all this stuff." And I said, "Well," I said, "Okay, but if I win, I want this much money." And the Japanese wrote back, and they agreed immediately because they said there was no way I was going to beat him. So they just, in the end, it was the largest payout in Shudo history.
Oh, well, that's a feather in your cap to grab that, because I was going to say, yeah, and for the masses, I bet you don't have any of that money left, because let's that it was probably the highest.
It's not. Yeah, it wasn't.
It wasn't
We're not
big
talking
money,
about
like,
Conor.
yeah.
It's not Conor McGregor money. And even at that time, my instructor, the character that he was, had taken half of our purse. That's one of the reasons Carlos actually ended up leaving my instructor.
Okay, and who was your? He was a judo guy. Who was your BJJ roots from?
It was judo and jiu-jitsu at the time. See, going back to, if you look at the time in Brazil where the Gracies had learned jiu-jitsu, it was judo instructors that were not allowed to teach jiu-jitsu. They were not allowed to teach judo because they were prize fighting. They had to call what they were doing jiu-jitsu, but they were all judo instructors. So there was a lineage that had gone to Brazil, but there was also a lineage that had gone to Europe. And my instructor had followed that lineage. So his judo / jiu-jitsu was the same stuff. There was a lot of overlap between what the Gracies were doing. So we were studying both judo and jiu-jitsu. We had the stand-up self-defense. We were doing surprise attacks, but I was competing in judo competitions at the national level, and our ground fighting was very different from the regular judo guys that we were facing. And then when the UFC hit, we just focused more on ground because it was just so popular. But there's reasons the Gracies focused more on ground within Brazil, and then within Europe, there's different factors that allow them to focus more on standing. But my instructor's lineage was not Brazilian. I had to go in then, more recently, in the past, later years of my life, affiliate with the Brazilian lineage. But originally, my instructor was not a Brazilian lineage.
Okay, very interesting, very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about Carlos for a minute. So
Sure.
You said he was your junior, but he preceded you into the MMA world,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Now,
he was a genetically gifted specimen. Like, Carlos was interesting, and I taught my students about him because he was one of those guys that was so relaxed as a training partner. You have training partners that are stiff, they shut everything down. And he was one of those guys that was slowly absorbing all your techniques. and he was so relaxed, and he would let you do stuff on him, and he would learn what you're doing. He was so relaxed that he would learn so quickly, and just super gifted.
So you were with him like for like the Gene Revere fight and things like that. Like I
So
think that was
Carlos,
he
it
fought for
was
John Peretti, right?
it was yeah. He fought, the first fight that Carlos did was against John Riviere on Indian reservation, and I was supposed to. I had the opportunity. I missed the opportunity to fight on that card. I was writing an exam at the university, and I came home. That was when you had call display. It was a big deal, and I had something like 12 missed calls from my instructor, which was unheard of because my instructor would never call me. And I called back, and he's like, "It's too late. They found somebody else." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "It was for this thing. You would have had to fight a boxer your size, which is a dream back then. Someone who doesn't." I think Henzo fought on that card. Henzo stomped on somebody's face on that card. Like it was the beginning of the Wild West. And
I think it was Ralph actually.
oh, you're right. Actually, you're right. Yes, your memory is good. It was. It was Half. It was Half that stepped on somebody's head. Yeah, that's right.
For sure, for sure. Hey, those are legendary cards. Actually, all those fighters got arrested afterwards in Canada.
Correct. They were looking. That was the one thing that I had like. I kind of like felt good about the fact that I didn't fight because I remember they were looking for Carlos at the time, and I was in the clear.
Yep, yep. Now, uh, now you're a lifelong martial artist, but back then, like you said, people were getting arrested and it was looked down upon. How did you see that transition happen in Canada where now you guys have a lot of respect and, you've made a life and a career out of it, and guys like St. Pierre and things like that came after you are big stars and not like pariah stars, like or controversial stars. They're mainstream guys. How you're a part of that. You're one of the guys. The first guys over the hill.
Yeah, I think. Listen, I still think it's there. Those stars are few and far between. There's a lot of people that were amazing that nobody talks about, and you know nobody's ever heard of. They're just amazing fighters, but people have short attention spans and they can only really focus on so many people at a time. You have guys like George that are obviously, those are generational athletes, let alone generational fighters. We're lucky to have produced a guy like that. But realistically, even within Canada, we didn't have we don't have a long list of guys with that level of pedigree.
Yeah. Talk about. Let's go back to the Rue Minosato fight. So,
Yeah.
was that your first time in Japan? How
Yes.
could you? Because we obviously just recently rewatched the fight, and it was your first fight, and then you take into account the whole long trip. You take into account that Shudo was small at the time, so it's not like you got pampered over there. You probably were in a small hotel. Maybe you had a.
It's actually funny. It's funny because you really are on the inside, and you've been around for a while. You the matchmaker, some legendary matchups yourself, so But what's interesting is just in terms of nailing on the hotels. After I beat Sato, everything changed. They upgraded us to a different hotel. We were limousined around the city. The head of the Shudo Federation took Mr. Ishiyama. I remember he took us to some very fancy hotels. It was full VIP restaurant exposure. And I remember there was a Japanese fighter that was with us that had very broken English. And I remember he would use the word maximum a lot to explain things. And I remember we were sitting at a restaurant, and I remember that there was some mushroom dish, and he was down the table, and he yelled out in English. He goes, Joel Carlos, maximum expensive, maximum expensive. But yeah, everything changed once I had won for sure.
That's cool. That's cool. How did you adapt to the rules over there? Because at that point they used something called a catch and things like that. Were you aware of
Yeah.
what was going on? And how did you feel? Like, did you think the first round, and you won in the first round, but the early part of the round, I don't think you were ever lost. Like you were, like it has to be. It's a very even fight, but you had to think they're giving him the round, right?
Well, it's not just that. I don't think I would have made it past. Like I was going down. Like when you're in a video, your character in a video game, and your energy level is going down, down, down. The thing with Sato that's so interesting is you can't duplicate him in training. you could have, and we had a big grappling room. At that time, my instructor had a very popular gym. We had 50 guys grappling in the room at the same time, which is unheard of for late 90s. But you can't duplicate, there still hasn't, I mean, you can't duplicate those cat-like reflexes, the explosive punching and kicking, the wild flying entries to submissions. You could try, but his timing and his physicality, you're just going to duplicate. And so we would do no holds barred sparring in class, but nobody kicked me in the leg as hard as he kicked me. And I remember distinctly when he would kick me in the leg, like you would feel it in your spine, like your energy would just go down. And even the strikes in training, you're not duplicating it. And just going back to the training itself, it was the Wild West. So there was a disconnect between the boxing coach and jiu-jitsu instructor, strength and conditioning, the recovery. And I was a full-time university student. And at the time, I was going into training with just a head to toe full of injuries. It was at a point where I would go to physiotherapy and I wouldn't even tell them everything because I thought they would just think that something's, I was a hypochondriac or something. So every time I'd go back to physio, I would give them something else. And it got to the point where the clinic refrigerator had no more ice in it. I had all the ice packs. So it got to a point where the last couple of weeks of the training where we had to take our foot off the gas because nobody could touch me. I was just so beat up. And, knee issues, split, cartilage in the ribs, my ear, I had a cauliflower ear for the first time in my life. I just couldn't be touched. So when you go into a fight like that, it's really hard to recreate that in training. And the other thing is the striking was very late for me. Like I was not a striker, but there is something to be said for getting conditioned to be hit. And it's very hard to train that in 2 months. You really can't actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
for
when
sure.
you get it, so when you get into the fight, like, with all the respect to Sato, like if I had caught him in that armbar, I was dead to rights. And that's the thing is like it's hard to tell, but if you look in the video, like, and we get more into it, but I was squeezing that armbar so hard because I knew if he'd gone back to the feet, I was a dead man. So when I finally stood up, after the armbar was done, I could barely stand because my legs were so fried from the squeeze.
Wow.
Like my legs were buckling. Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, to be honest, you got some amazing throws in on him.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and obviously with your judo background, you did that. But didn't you feel that you fought an even round? How did you feel about your performance?
I guess I'm not taking the takedowns into consideration. I think I had one, I had a couple takedowns, but those strikes do add up. We had a very specific strategy going in with him, and the funny thing is, like, even though I needed to get the fight to the ground, I didn't want to be in his guard. He just had a very dynamic guard, and no gi passing then isn't what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
There's no Danner or DVD, and the Mendez brothers are not showing anything back then. They didn't exist back then, unfortunately, because I would have loved to been around. But getting past Sato's guard, let alone entering it and ground and pounding, was not part of the strategy at all. So I had to have a very specific path to get around the legs and get on top in order to find something.
So why what happened on the return fight? Now you got a Brazilian, and the Japanese and the Brazilian fighters have a different mindset. There's no shame in taking a loss at those Brazilian guys who came more efficient game, like looking to like trying to kill you more than where Sato wanted to compete with you. I think, is that a fair assessment? Do you feel that?
I think so. I fought Ricardo Botelho, who was a brown belt at the time. He had medaled at the World Championships in Jiu-Jitsu. He had like inconsistent success in MMA before me, and I didn't have great conditioning for that fight. After beating Sato, I was kind of, once you come down from that peak, you don't really have the drive wasn't the same. And in Toronto, one of the things that we had to do for training was acclimate to fighting in Japan. So I'd be getting up at 5 a.m. to train, and then going back to bed. It's really tough because I'm still training in the evenings. I'm going to university, so that starts to wear on you. Then this and that. I don't know. The preparation wasn't as good as what it could have been, and he had a very good strategy in the fight against me. What's funny is he normally is a southpaw. So with my boxing coach, I trained everything against a southpaw, and then as soon as we started the fight, he stood traditional, and that scrambled my brain for that. There was a hiccup. I remember when I saw that. And then I ended up getting him down and doing some stuff, but he had a very good pressure strategy. And I lost a split decision to him. Some people said I should have taken the decision. When I look at it, I'm like, I could see why the judges gave it to him, but I didn't have that aggressive fight. Like the being an MMA fighter was not my destiny. So it wasn't like the only thing I could do, and I didn't go into it with all of those motivations. Plus, when you have a coach that's taking half of your purse, it kind of you don't really what's the point?
Yeah, no. Those were truly days that you had to love it, and like you said, your destiny was more of that of an instructor, and
Yes.
and it's paid off for you, because definitely being an instructor is, I we heard your name throughout the years, and it was always like, actually, when I pulled up the fight, it's been a while, and when I was looking for a fight to show, I mixed it up with the Alan Freed fight, which you probably saw in the preparation. Alan Freed was a wrestler that Sato came out and armbarred in like 6 seconds,
Oh, right, yeah.
And I was like, all right, I'm going to show this to Sato. And I was like, oh, this is that fight. And then it was like, do I show Rumina losing, the all-time hero losing in the first fight that we're going to highlight? And I said, you know what? Damn right we are. We're going to show that because Joel has been 30 years still doing this stuff and teaching people, and some of the Canadian guys owe him a debt of gratitude as far as an instructor. So talk about some of your students after that. You stopped MMA. I assume you finished college, you continued on your path to a black belt. Now we'll ask you about some of your students, but I also had a couple of other names that came up. Wagner Fabiano.
Of course.
He's a black belt that went and moved to Montreal. How did he
came to
teach?
Toronto.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So there's Wagner, and then there's also hold on. There's a black belt that came to the Samurai Club where we were training with Carlos, and he was our size, and his name is he fought Hoyler many times in the World Championships.
Okay.
It was Wagner. Wagner came after. It was Joao Hawk.
Okay.
And Joao fought Ikeda in Shuto.
Yeah,
he was a really, really good jiu-jitsu guy.
Yeah.
Really good. He couldn't stand the Canadian winters. He had a rough life here. His family was back home, and it was a very lonely existence here when you have twin babies back home at the time. But he came and, he taught a little bit at the club. We were training partners for a little bit. Wagner Fabiano came later.
Yeah.
But he's
the generation before, but he's another elite of the elite. I actually had the honor of judging him and Hoyler in Abu Dhabi.
You're kidding.
No, so I saw that up close. So
I remember watching those fights and just going, man, like Hoyler, like I remember sparring with Joao and then seeing what Hoyler beat him, and just thinking like, I can't imagine how good Hoyler is. And Hoyler's one of the world champions that I've never sparred with. I've sparred with everybody. I think a lot of guys. I've gotten beat up by the best, but Hoyler, I've only seen him in seminars. I've never got a chance to
feel him.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. But John Hawk comes from the Pederneiras camp that.
Yeah.
Pederneiras
kicked Sato in the head.
Yeah, and he did the job on Sato, but not until after you'd done it. That's the thing, is people remember that. And to be honest with you, a knockout's a knockout. When you're in an MMA fight, I feel like a knockout, you're always at risk of that. Yes. But to submit Sato is definitely a more impressive feat. I mean, just to take my hats off to you again, because that's the kind of thing that put us here. To actually submit that man in the way you did it, you said your legs were tight and you were tight. He wasn't getting out. He was not getting out of that move.
Listen, but if you look, what's interesting is he held on for, I've timed it, I think it was 21 seconds. There was damage to his arm, but he wasn't giving up, which is crazy. And you can see, I try everything. I go, I call it the shark fin variation, where your knee is bent against the body. because I tell the kids like a shark fin.
Mhm.
So I went from there, and you see him bridge. I put my leg across the chest. I put him down and everything. But he's just one of those guys. Like he's the final boss of the video game
Yeah.
at the
Did
time.
he tap or did the ref stop it?
Ref stopped it.
Yeah, because it didn't look like you couldn't see a tap, and on they don't show multiple angles or anything, but I couldn't see a
Yeah.
tap. So very fascinating stuff. So let's talk about some of your students. After you had your MMA pair of fights, and then you become a teacher. Who was the first student that you got that you put into the MMA world that became somebody that the American public might know that beyond Canada?
It's funny. I never focused on producing professional fighters. I never wanted to be a part of it. I was always more interested because I'd grown up competing, and I coached people through provincial and national level competitions. But for professional MMA, I just knew that it wasn't the path. Like I like teaching regular people more.
Okay,
It's
and that's
for
cool.
me. It was. Listen, my clubs have always been more like family oriented. I've never wanted to have a fight club at the gym. It's not. It just changed the culture of a facility.
Yeah.
Sure,
You know what I mean?
sure.
So for us, it's always been. I've always had large kids classes. We've always, lots of regular guys coming in looking to get in shape. That people used to come to me and say like, I want to fight MMA, and the first thing I would ask them is, well, were you beaten as a child? And they would say to me, no, why? And I said, well, listen, I can teach anybody to give a beating. You're gonna have to learn how to take a beating, and you're competing against guys that were beaten by adults as children. So, what do you think you're going to do to them? Like, this is a crazy path. And honestly, back then, the paydays for MMA fighters at 155 or the lighter weights, and even today, it's a questionable return on investment.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so
I want to touch on
very
something because
wise.
there's something he touched on two things. The earlier was being conditioned to get hit, in a fight, and also what you just said about learning to take a beating. Like maybe touch on those two things, being conditioned to get hit in a fight and learning how to take a beating, and why you kind of use that kind of phrasing for people getting into MMA.
I think people don't know what's involved. It's one thing to go and train for a week. But we, uh, people don't realize what it's like to be in a sport where the whole point is to get hurt and to make it to the big show without being injured, incapacitated. Now, there's always an inherent risk with all professional athletics, whether it's basketball, football, soccer. There's an inherent risk to all those activities of getting injured. But when you're dealing with mixing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with wrestling and Muay Thai and all these different things, it's par for the course. So it's one thing to be motivated to train as a regular athlete. It's a whole other thing to be motivated to train when you're already in pain. So it's tough for these guys to do this without some kind of supplementation that can mask the pain, which creates a whole other feedback cycle, which is super dangerous, or to give them the strength to recover with a natural method. And I also knew that actually going back to one of the reasons I stopped competing is I knew I would have to supplement in order to be competitive. And it just wasn't that important for me. I was never interested in taking steroids or anything like that. But I knew even at the time back then, like people were on stuff, and the juice wasn't worth the squeeze.
Now, this is a little bit of a controversial subject. Do you think Sato was on something?
I can't. I don't know. I think listen. He was much bigger back then. I saw him in Vegas. He was a lot smaller naturally than what he was back then. But creatine and lifting can do wonders. Like I don't know much about steroids. Like I'm not one of those guys that can say, "Oh, this guy was on steroids." I don't know. I'd love to know for sure, but it wouldn't have changed anything. I know that when he came to Canada when he fought in the jiu-jitsu tournament in Canada, we were in different weight categories. So he was the weight category above me in a jiu-jitsu tournament, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. No, I think he had God's gifts. He was an elite athlete and stuff like that. But for the time, his musculature and things like that,
What do you
I
think?
I think it's possible. I'm with you. I can't say with any definitive ability, with it, and not sound like an ignorant person. You know what I mean? It's like I can't say, but I think it's very possible. I think the Japanese culture sort of is not. It's not as prevalent as in the American culture. So that's why I say the possibility is there. It's not extreme, and also. Um, he lost. He still had some elite moments for years afterwards, but then he did get to a point where age caught him more than anything, like where that explosiveness that you described and stuff seemed to have left him, and he still looked fantastic. He still had all the technique. He still was extremely dangerous, but it was that split hair of athleticism that he lost with age that caused him to start losing fights more consistently in the end of his career. So, yeah, I think it's possible.
There was a couple things I think that affected him. I think he had a bad style matchup with the Japanese fighter
Uno.
Uno, and they wanted me to fight Uno. Actually, they kept faxing over and over again, and they were just. It was one of those assumed closes where like, oh, Mr. Gerson's going to fight Mr. Uno, and at that point, I already told my instructor I don't want to go back. Like, it's exhausting. It wasn't fun. I didn't enjoy it, and like, I don't want to do it anymore. But they wanted me to fight Uno, and I remember my instructor trying to convince me to take the fight because he was arguing that he wasn't a big striker. He was more of a grappler, more of a grappling match. But the thing, when you look at Uno, his conditioning was so good, and I think that's one of the ways he managed to grind down Sato was just that pace, but he was also pretty clean technically.
Yeah.
So that was a bad style matchup, and then I think also Sato got knocked out a bunch, which makes it easier to then get knocked out a bunch.
Yeah, and I think Sato as he aged, also the shooter loyalty, as you mentioned, was obviously you take your hat off, but I think he started to question. And when you start having doubts in your own mind, that also affects the way that you can fight. I'll tell you, for example, in Abu Dhabi, a lot of people will not remember this, but the first time the Japanese team came, Sato was obviously the big star, and he got sick and didn't compete the first year that he was there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then he came back the second year and took a loss to a Brazilian, and in the absolute loss to Tito Ortiz.
Right.
So yeah,
That's
but
right.
he sat out the entire first year that he was there. It was like, I'm sick, my stomach, and yeah. I remember
that's the thing. When you travel, like you're eating foreign foods, it's like that's such a thing that could happen.
Yeah. So but I think that at some point he started having a little doubts in himself. Like it just wasn't that crazy confidence that I think you kind of have to, that you can beat anybody at that elite level. I think that's part of it too. And I that's the part I see on him. And but he was my favorite too. I used to talk with him about, me and Joe Silva used to exchange tapes. We'd mail tapes to each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had Brazilian connections. He had Japanese connections, and we'd exchange tapes.
Funny.
So for sure, that was that. So talk about, you did rematch him in a grappling match in Canada.
I did.
Talk about that experience.
Live to Fight is the type of company that Dana killed. It's a homegrown. It's a guy that just does good work, and puts it out there. And if you can support him, you really should, because he's precisely a guy who can't, his banners may not be able to hang on the UFC because he hasn't been able to pay them $100,000 to get his stuff out there. That's the corporate stuff that we're talking about now with the UFC, that, they've made everything at that level where it's all about money for them. And Live to Fight is a dude that does good work, makes you a great banner, and, doesn't have $100,000 to get on the UFC and stuff, and deserves support. So any fighter out there, anybody out there, owner of a gym or anything like that listens to us, God bless you and thank you very much for your support. And extend that to Live to Fight, because he's one of us. Those guys are one of us.
All right, so Miguel, you can go ahead and continue.
So what the lore is behind the whole, Joe Gerson, Rumi Nasato story is that he came to Canada and did a rematch with you at a BJJ tournament. Why don't you describe that scenario?
So this is what happened. He came to Canada to check out Canada, quote unquote. and he came to visit our club with it was the president of the Shooter Federation and some reporters. Remember, it was Mr. Ishiyama. So they were like special guests, and we took some
Sakamoto was the other one,
balls.
right?
Sakamoto was there.
Yeah.
Wow, you guys are good.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sakamoto. That's right. So we hosted them, and I'm trying to think if he came to training first. I don't think he did. He didn't come to training, and he came to watch. That's what it was. He came to watch the Canadian Open. It was my instructor was hosting these big Canadian Opens, and we would have fighters from all over: Brazilians, Russians, high-level judo guys that had defected from the World Championships in Hamilton, and my instructor convinced Sato to sign up. And my instructor was convinced that he was going to sign up anyways, and that he was going to come and like make a thing out of it, and like that was his intention. But originally he wasn't going to compete. And the way it worked out was because we were hosting, I was in charge of like setup. And I remember just being exhausted. Like I had gone through my division, so I'd won my division. And remember, he was a weight division up. And just the way I was raised with like the sort of Japanese fight philosophy was you always fight guys that are bigger than you. You never turn down a fight. You're sick, you fight. You're broken, you fight. Like you just fight. It was just like the way we did it. And after I had won my division, there was the open division. And under any circumstance, I'd go to the open just, for the spirit, for like fighting spirit. And I knew if I went, I'd have to fight Sato. And the reality was like, I wasn't looking to fight him again. Like it just wasn't on my list. I wasn't mentally ready to fight him. I hadn't strategized that. I had just focused on my division, and I was tired, and I was just focused on like strategically winning my division, and that was it. I hadn't had a game plan for him. I didn't know how I would beat him in a pure grappling match. I hadn't even thought about it. It wasn't on my radar. And I remember I had gone through the first couple rounds, and so had he, and we were fighting. And then we were like on mat 3 or something. We were fighting, and all the other mats had shut down the fights to watch this fight. And they were calling fights to like another mat, and people were yelling at them to just shut up and wait because everybody wanted to watch this fight. And they're like, "Stop! Shut up! Like it's not happening. Nobody's fighting right now. Everybody's watching this fight." And I even remember like when he and I started fighting for that on that. If you call it a rematch, my focus wasn't like I was not even properly focused. I could hear the audience, I could hear things in the crowd that I shouldn't have been able to hear, and my mind would go to it. Like I wasn't super focused. And he had pushed me at one point, and I'd gone in for a drop Sonagi out of reflex, and then that's it. He got his hooks in. He was like, it was the first time that I had been choked on the face, and it worked. Like it worked. Like it was an actual choke. It wasn't like underneath the chin. Like it was one of those revolutionary things. But what's interesting with Sato is I remember watching him warm up before the tournament and getting freaked out because his movement was so good. Like forget about striking. Just watching him practice guard passing and the fluidity and the cat-like movements that he was doing, his setups for leg locks and everything, just everything he was doing, and just going like, this guy is just something else. And I remember on the underground, someone had commented after the competition, and they said, Gerson is good, but Sato is great. And I was like, yeah, they think that's fair. I'll accept that. But it was Newton tearing people up in the competition, Sato beating my teammates with flying triangles, and just being on fire. And he took the open weight division that year. He got a beautiful big trophy. I don't know how he got it back to Japan, but he beat me fair and square. And my instructor's take on it was, I so did not want to face him again in MMA. I'd rather take the loss on my home soil in grappling than have to, because they knew like I would have to go back and have a rematch with him. So I was like, I was so not in the mood to do that I somehow convinced myself to lose in the grappling match.
Now, let me ask you, was this no gi or with a gi?
Yeah, it was whatever you wanted to wear. It was the Wild West.
Okay.
So if you wanted to choke someone with their jock strap, you could choke someone with their jock strap. It's within the rules.
Okay.
You could pull hair.
Did you wear a gi?
So this was so stupid because it in most of my matches, I was no gi. I was just in shorts. And then I remember now, oh, I just remembered something else. And then when I went against him, I was also in like bike shorts. But then what happened after this is what people don't talk about. After that competition, he came to my gym. And now the pressure was off and we sparred. And that was different. So then we sparred, and during the sparring, I wore a gi jacket and a belt. And I have pictures. Hold on. I think I have something handy on my phone. We'll see if they're saved in the liked images. But we sparred, and then yes. Hold on. Where's the camera?
Oh, there we go.
Right there. Oh, look at that.
So that's at the Samurai Club. Oh, he's wearing a gi top too. That's right. Sorry, I was in full gi, and he's wearing gi top. You see us on the knees, so I was on my knees because I didn't want to leg lock me. And then, yeah, it's funny. And there's Hickson. This is a different day, but this was like a crazy time back then. Where's the camera?
It's right there.
Right there.
Yeah,
This is
there
a '97.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Anyways, so then what happened was, this is funny. So this is kind of like, dojo lore, but the way it worked in my academy was we did fights at the end of every class. Like I said, it didn't matter, and because I was the senior in my gym and just who I was, my positioning, the way it would work was we'd finish class and Moni would say, "Joel, choose," and I would choose who I'd want to fight, and I'd have to go through like the first couple of guys because we'd sit in a hierarchy. So you'd pick the biggest guy, the highest ranked, the black, whatever it was there, you'd have to fight him, win or lose. So he knew, like, I basically had to fight him again, and this was my opportunity for the best at 3. So he goes, "Joel, choose." He knew, and I knew. I knew that he was going to ask me, and it was just different at this point. So we did a grappling match at my academy in front of the Japanese media. And I've poked around, I messaged Mr. Sakamoto for video footage. I'm trying to get video footage of that fight. I have like a grainy, I don't think it's saved in my phone. I have it somewhere, but hang on a second. I have an old picture of us doing this fight, but I remember listen, that was a different time, but like, that was when strategically I was much more on point with what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do. And it was much more my game in terms of like, what I should have done in the arena in front of everybody. And I had done better. And arguably, it depends on the points. There was no points and cares. And he didn't, for him, it was, who knows what it meant. It probably meant nothing. And he had already won. So I don't know. But in my head, I'd be in the club. So I was happy with that. I didn't submit him, but like I felt like I outpointed him, and I like nickel and dimed him on some takedowns and stuff. And he would try to, he tried his fancy flying stuff. That this was a dinner in Japan with Mr. Ishiyama. Hold on, where's the camera?
Yeah, it's right there.
You see Carlos? Hold on, I go this way.
Right there, yeah. That's good.
Perfect.
Yeah. The old school stuff.
Yeah, I got some old school stuff hanging around here. There's another picture. Oh, here. Okay, so this was more from the sparring.
Put it right in the middle, right in front of your face.
Like
your camera's right in front of your face.
That right?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's the sparring, but this is the grappling match.
Okay, so he went in with no gi.
Yes, he took the gi off and he's like, "Fuck that noise. This guy's not grabbing anything." But that's when I wore my gi. Yeah, this is back when you had like actual camera. But look how many people are in the room.
Yeah, that's for 90s. That's a major grappling room for sure.
98. Like it's crazy. But I don't know. It was a crazy time. Listen, it was a very stressful time when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, because his legend preceded him. There's a reason there was an aura about him, and there's a reason he had a reputation. He was a great fighter.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something, because what you said is you don't hear that a lot. most people when they go to Japan and they, fight in Shuto, where most of them lost that would come to up from other places, but they always seem to be pretty happy with the experience. You said you didn't really enjoy doing it.
Well, the thing is, it was like super stressful, especially against Sato. And then when I went back the next time, it was less stressful. But you have a job to do. It's a mission, and in my head, the expectation was to win. So even it was different with Sato. That was elation when I won. But you come down hard after fights. You try and peak for this physical activity, mentally, physically, psychologically, but the come down is a big drop, and then you have jet lag, and then Japanese culture. It's a bit of a culture shock, but it's you're not able to communicate.
Yeah.
It's kind of stifling from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah.
So I think I had a better time the second time. It was just me and my instructor, and we walked the streets of Japan and whatnot. But there were some interesting things that happened. When we went the first time. So my instructor had studied with Katsuhiko Kashiwazaki. I don't know if you know who that is. Kashiwazaki was a judo world champion that before any VHS DVDs existed, the Brazilians wrote BJJ books. All the books were written by Japanese through the judo lineage. Kashiwazaki was a choking specialist, Yoko Tomonagi specialist, and an arm lock specialist. He was a very famous world champion in Japan. There's Yasuhiro Yamashita was a big name in Japan. It's like the Michael Jordan for many years, the equivalent in basketball. And there was Kashiwazaki. So my instructor had trained with Kashiwazaki. So when the Japanese media interviewed my instructor and he had mentioned him, somebody had organized for us to visit Kashiwazaki at one of the universities or one of the training centers. And again, back then, you don't have big BJJ academies, but you had training centers with, enough guys in your weight division that it's like you're fighting the bad guys in the Matrix. It's just one after another, after another, after another. So we went with Japanese media to Katsura University. And Katsura University, it was just all black belts. And we came in wearing our white belts. Our instructor was like, "Hey, you guys wearing white belts at this place?" And it was very cool because, like, I remember Kashiwazaki, they had us go again one after another. Like, they shark tanked us. And I remember arm locking the first guy that they threw at me. And I remember Kashiwazaki saying, into the media that I had good arm locks here. And I remember that was like something I took to my grave before Joe Rogan talked about me. But that was here, which is kind of cool. But he was like, that was, this is like, can you see here?
Yeah,
there's like that warehouse. Many guys. It's a big, but the training mats were like super soft and everything. But we got exposure to all kinds of opportunities that otherwise you wouldn't have gotten access to.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just interesting little things that happen on the trip, but it's exhausting.
Yeah, it's nice to have those opportunities, but at the same time, if you're there to fight, also it kind of starts to take up your time. It starts to take up your change your mindset and things like that. I've had fighters go to Japan that didn't like the food, so like they wind up eating McDonald's. It's like you can't do that before a fight, Not really, you know what I mean?
I was a university student, so it's not like I had tons of money. Like, they gave us a daily stipend, but I knew Japan would be expensive, so I brought protein bars with me. And so we were walking around, like, the other fighters, like Carlos and Omar at the time, they had burned through their stipend in no time. And I was happy with my protein bars. But the next time we went, we would go to all you can eat sushi places and clean them up.
Yeah. Now, while I don't know if Todd wants to wrap up, but you mentioned Sato and how special an athlete he was, and now that I've been thinking about it, him and Newton have some similarities in terms of that special ability stuff like that. Talk a little bit about compare the two guys, and they didn't fight in that absolute. They didn't fight in that open weight.
No, and I think that it's a very good. I know it's. I think Carlos would have smashed it. I don't think people realize how good. I watched the video of the Canadian Open in '97 with fresh eyes this year, just because I was going through, like you see these pictures, I was going through my old stuff, and I wanted to watch it with modern eyes, just to look back and you look back like I can't watch my old videos because I think I was trash and I'm so much better now, and like I can't look at my technique back then and be impressed. But I looked at Newton and I was like, man, he was so ahead of his time in his movement, just everything, the way he was connecting everything. It was just, I called him up and I was like, I have to tell you something. It was really beautiful. But Carlos would have smashed. I think he would have. I think he would have put the pace on. He was bigger, a lot bigger, and he's freakishly strong. But he had excellent leverage and balance and positioning. But I think they're both very similar athletes in terms of their genetic gifts. And I don't know if Sato was a hard worker in training. I
Yeah,
find
he
that
was.
the most talented guys are usually not. And they're eventually beaten by guys that are just much, much harder workers. Because eventually everybody's talented and can work hard. But Carlos was one of those guys that he was a talented guy. And I wonder if Sato had the work ethic that eventually everybody else caught up to him who had a similar or harder work ethic. I don't know.
I remember I went to Shudo many times. I never took a guy to fight Sato, but I took a few other guys there to fight. Um, like later Mishima, who was one of their big stars afterwards and stuff. Um, and Sato had a whole bunch of like conditioning videos, and
Mm,
they hyped that about him. So superficially, I can tell you that I'm not sure that that was the case. I think he was a hard worker as well. Um, but
interesting.
but I can't tell you for sure. Now with Carlos, I recently heard this, and I wonder if you can corroborate this because this is now I know Carlos. I judged one of his fights when he fought in Indiana one time for a promoter named Jamie Levine, and I was at the fight. I was actually about 5 feet from him during that exchange with Matt Hughes, where
Oh
he went
wow.
down and stuff like that. I was, with a camera, octagon side. So I've been around Carlos. Um, and he's a guy that he also had the mind game, because he
Mm.
kind of comes across as a mild mannered and nice and stuff like that. But he's getting in your head. I heard that if he heard that you were that they were trying to match him up with somebody, if he could, he would visit them. Have you ever heard that story? Like where he
No,
would we visit them and just
he's
try to
not.
hang out with them and stuff like that?
He's not aggressive like that. He would most likely avoid. I feel like I don't think he overthinks stuff. I think that he was very free in his spirit that way,
Yeah,
and
that's
he
the
would just
Ronin.
he was well the Ronin. You know where the Ronin came from though? It's when he left my instructor because we were the Samurai Club, and then when he would leave, he didn't have an instructor. He was a masterless samurai. So that's where the Ronin came from. He
Gotcha.
was like it's a wandering samurai, so to speak. But he was like he would just feel. He was one of those feelers, and I don't think he would overthink in terms of strategy. It's to a point where when he and I competed in grappling matches, I until the end I was beating him every time just because I would pick a better strategy than him. So I would outpoint him and everything, and it would frustrate my instructor because Carlos was bigger than me and Carlos should beat me, but I would always play the game a little bit better. But until the end, like in the end, you get me like in the final years. But he strategically, I feel like sometimes maybe was too free.
Okay. Okay,
D-
that's
Like
interesting. Do you stay in touch with him?
once in a while we check in. He's a big monster now. He's a big bear. Like you still don't want to grapple him. He's like 40.
Did
The
you
guy that
hear
fought
that
in.
he was behind the UFC lawsuit stuff? Did you hear that?
Oh, that actually, I was gonna say, did you hear that he's behind the UFC
Well, we
lawsuit?
we talked to
Yes,
the lawyer and he told us the story about this. He said
yes.
Carlson contacted me. I didn't know what he wanted. You know,
People don't realize this.
yeah,
It's all because of Carlos.
yeah,
It's all because of Carlos.
yeah.
And the only reason he's not named is because he's Canadian.
Yeah.
That's why he can't get a piece of the pie. They had to put American fighters behind it. But he came to us with this idea of the lawsuit back in the day, and he's like, nah, what these guys are doing is illegal, man. I'm gonna talk to some lawyers and everything. And like we were like, Carlos, you're crazy. Like you're wasting your time. Like this is insane talk. And look now
Yeah.
what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, for sure.
Bob said even when he met up with him, he still wasn't sure what he wanted. And then he took him to his office and he started going through all his stuff. He had all, he starts working on stuff. And Bob's like, for the next few days, and he's like, "What are we doing? What is this?"
Tom, be more clear.
Yeah,
Carlos locked himself. Now you're
yeah,
talking about a lawyer's office with like the lawyer's books with precedent and things like
yeah,
that. And Carlos was looking up cases
yeah,
like
yeah,
to help with the lawsuit. And he said, and the lawyer didn't realize what was going on, kind of
yeah.
thing. But Carlos is that's where
He's
that's why I respect the mental part too. That doesn't
yeah,
surprise me. It's like, man, he's out of this world.
he's interesting. Like his mind works in this special way. Like you can underestimate him in some ways, but then it's like he can be very wise in other ways.
For sure.
Yeah, and
For
he
sure.
was telling him, we're gonna file this lawsuit, and you're gonna be the one to do it. Because I can't do it, so you're doing it, Bob.
He
That's what
put
he
he
told
put a
Bob.
lot of time into that whole
Yeah,
thing, which is crazy when you think about it. Like you're gonna go against Dana and the Fertitta brothers. Like that's just, you know, all of a sudden you're gonna wake up and then there's gonna be a news article that you committed suicide, like the guy
Yeah.
from Boeing. Like what are you doing?
or pride.
There's
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Oh look,
Barista.
Carlos jumped out a window. That's
Yeah.
sad. Why would he do that?
Well, thank God he did. Thank God, and they stayed with it. And thank God we saw him compete too, because like I agree with you completely. From those days, there are very few. A lot of the guys were tough, and a lot of the guys, you had the Harold Howards from Canada and stuff like that. But when you saw someone special like Carlos, I think, or Sato, you recognize that right away, for sure, for sure. So very interesting. And I want to thank you very much for this time, Joel. Very,
My pleasure.
very
Thanks,
much
guys.
great insight, Todd. If you have more, I would love to stay on and hear Joel talk all day. But
You're funny and sweet.
Yeah, I'll just ask
That's
you
nice.
one thing though, because I lived there from 2000 to 2002 to 2005. I lived in Japan, so I went to
Mm.
a billion fights. I went to Krakow Hall all the time. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, like, I know you said you didn't enjoy it, that the fight and all that stuff, but looking back on it, like fighting in Krakow Hall, how did that
Well, it's
how
funny.
how did that stand out to you? Because for the hardcores for us, because I lived on Oahu before I lived in Japan. And we were all exposed to the Shuto guys because TJ was bringing them to fight in Super Brawl. So we kind of were watching Shuto events then. So that was we thought that was the best promotion, even though it was smaller. So
So
I
it's
just wanted
it's
to ask
funny.
you.
I grew up on professional wrestling. I grew up watching Hulk Hogan and all these guys, and you know, I grew up mostly an only child, so I'd occupy my time by putting the Rocky soundtrack in and coming down the stairs into the couch, wrestling my pillows to fight, like to music that was my entrance music. And then I actually only realized this like a bunch of years ago. I don't remember exactly. I'm very bad with timelines. Like as a grown adult, I realized that I had fulfilled a childhood dream, which was to come out to a fight to my own entrance music.
sure.
I think everybody's got a song that they like. This would be my entrance music song. And I realized that I had actually done that, which was wild because at the time it wasn't my dream at that moment. But as a kid growing up watching wrestling, this was so from a psychic level, it was like very satisfying to realize that I connected those two things. So to answer your question, yeah, listen, getting beaten up by Sato was not pleasurable, but what's come from it and the memories and the legacy and the notch on my belt as a martial artist, I can't regret it. I can't regret it. It's one of those things that if if I didn't, reality is if I didn't push myself to go past the fear of getting smashed and losing against this guy, I would never have had a lot of the success that would come from it.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's awesome. The pro wrestling thing back, in the old days, they didn't even really have to admit that it was entertainment. So there was more of an aspect of like when we were kids, I think we kind of thought it was real. That was fighting for us. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
I associate that. And instantly now I want to talk to you about Dino Bravo and a whole bunch of the Canadian guys that
Well,
that put
I'll
in
tell you,
time.
I'll tell you something funny that happened to me. Because, like, listen, Sato was like, people knew who he was, but so I hosted Vandalay Silva once
Okay.
for a seminar at my gym. And Vanderlei is an amazing guy in person. Like, I got along with him really well. I remember going for dinner with him before the seminar through our connection. And we're sitting and we're connecting dots, and he realizes, so I'm very bad with names, even if I know someone very well. The guy who's coaching Mike Tyson now, his name
Rafael
is
Cordero.
Rafael Cordero.
Yeah.
So Rafael Cordero lost to Sato.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done privates with Rafael Cordero in Vegas at Vanderlei's gym at one point. And I'll come back to that. But I'm having to do with Vanderlei, and Vanderlei all of a sudden realizes that I beat the guy that beat his instructor. And all of a sudden, Vanderlei is just gushing over me. Like, you understand how surreal this is for me.
Yeah.
I'm just like a regular martial artist that's like a fan like everybody else that had some success, but like, I'm not a Vanderlei Silva. And so I'm sitting with Vanderlei, and Vanderlei's like, you beat the guy that beat my master. and he's giving me all this respect that is just blowing my mind. And then now on a go forward basis, I have the respect from Vanderlei Silva, which is insane. So then I go to and then eventually I go to his club to train. I go to visit him in Vegas, and Rafael Cordero is there, and I do private with him, and we spar, and it's very respectful, and he's a crazy and all this stuff, and we're talking about the fight, and he said he so underestimated Sato that he didn't even prepare and watch tape. And he was like, who's this guy? I'm gonna kick this guy's ass. And he said that the story he told me was he was in the change room warming up, and they always have a video playing, like a TV screen with the video. And while he's warming up, they're showing a highlight of Sato. And he's warming up, and he's like, doing this stuff. He looks at this video, and he's like, what the fuck? And he couldn't believe all of a sudden what he'd gotten himself into. He had not prepared, and he ended up losing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny how, like, if the math doesn't necessarily add up, between all these different guys, but it's just interesting how everything is so interconnected.
Yeah, it was Japan Valley 203. I probably watched the show 100 times, 1,000 times.
This interview is about you, Joel, but you just I could share a similar story with the Vanderlei crew.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Rafael Cordero's last MMA fight was against a guy named Henry Matamoros. I took Henry to Brazil to fight him. They fought 30 minutes, no gloves. They both had their faces out to here. Rafael won the decision. But even the Brazilians, they came to me and go, your guy wins with no time limit. So we were in the neighborhood, But fast forward a year later to a fight where Carlos was in Georgia for Jamie Levine. I had Henry there. And again, Henry didn't care. Henry's a Costa Rican who was a black belt under Pedro Sauer. So at the time, a brown belt under Pedro Sauer. So he was like, you come to make sure I get paid. I don't need a corner. We'll find a corner there. So a lot of times I came out the corner, like against Cordero, I was his corner. And he was fighting a big military guy that beat him in that Georgia show. And when we were coming out, Pele and Rudimar were behind me to go, we're going to go with you, because he had won their respect. So they definitely were guys that paid attention to that, like Vanderlei recognized you and things like that.
That's the thing.
That wasn't me. That was Henry, but it was all on his blood and sweat. But those guys were Class A guys.
Yeah, and they still had that respect for the hierarchy, which I thought was so interesting. Like, even though it wasn't like a Japanese belted system, Vanderlei still had this reverence for his coach and respect for his coach, even though he could kick his coach's ass at this point. Like, it didn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I remember with Henry, we were watching them train, and they had there was a big open room with a pole in the middle, and they had taken mats and wrapped them around the pole, and they were all running and hitting it with a knee, And Henry, before the fight, writes his mother's phone number down and goes, just in case. I was like, oh my God. So yeah, those guys were very serious guys, and thank you for sharing that. It gives me a little bit of a buzz because I don't compete, don't have any of that background, but being around guys like that, you recognize how special it is. And that's what you've given us here, is some very special stories and some very special memories, because nobody has those experiences, but you are very unique and very special. and I'm grateful
you
for
very
his
much.
time, man. Thank you for
Thank you. I really
sharing with
appreciate
us,
it.
man.
Thanks for. It's
For
nice
sure.
to have some old school guys around to be able to share stories that can throw some names around that I haven't heard in a while. That have walked the walk, and different paths than me, but in the same area.
It's crazy, yeah, and definitely admirable men. In general, the guys that were in the MMA game and in the jiu-jitsu game and stuff like that, trying to bring it to the world level, are not all of them are, but many of them are admirable men. And you number them as definitely as one of those, man. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, it was great talking to you and great meeting you. And for everyone who supports these shows, we appreciate it. And until next time, take care.
Hi, it's Claudia Correa, and I just want to sit down and thank you all for watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with Todd Atkins and Miguel Iterate. Miguel has been the matchmaker of over 200 shows across the world. Miguel has worked with Hook and Shot, Euphoria, Bodog Fight, and ADCC. You can also find Miguel on his YouTube channel at MMA Collector 74. And don't forget to follow me at It's Claudia Correa.